Hi, everyone. Welcome to our DASER online experiment. I'm JD Tolosik. I'm the Director of Cultural Programs at the National Academy of Sciences. DASER, which stands for DC Art Science Evening Rendezvous, is a cross-disciplinary salon that meets on a regular basis for bringing people from different communities into conversation. The goal of DASER is to encourage networking between disciplines and to foster a general spirit of collaboration and integrative thinking. We ask questions like, how can different disciplines inform one another? Can this lead to innovative ideas that could impact science and the arts as well as society? DASER is co-hosted by Cultural Programs of the National Academy of Sciences and Issues in Science and Technology. You can find out more about our partners and their journal at issues.org. DASERs are also joined by a network of over 50 similar salons around the world called Lasers, organized by the network of Leonardo, the International Society of Art, Science, and Technology. And for this month, we welcome a new partner, American University, as part of their Climate Action Initiative. This is a year-long interdisciplinary program at American University focused on climate change. So our discussion today is on climate change and the creation of empathy. We are joined by a wonderful panel of experts. We have with us James Balog. James's 40 years as a photographer has focused on the human modification of nature. And we are proud to present a retrospective of his work at the National Academy of Sciences, which will be on view starting in October. The exhibit coincides with the release of a wonderful new book called The Human Element, a time capsule from the Anthropocene. We also have Diane Burko. Diane is a longtime friend of the Academy's. We've featured her in solo and group exhibits. She is an artist whose work focuses on monumental glacial phenomena. Since 2006, her practice has been at the intersection of art, science, and the environment, devoted to the urgent issues of climate change. We also have Maggie Stogner. Maggie is the executive director of the Center for Environmental Filmmaking at American University. With over 30 years as a filmmaker, she is the founder of Blue Bear Films, an independent production company for documentaries. And she was a producer of National Geographic's weekly series, Explorer, for 9 years. Ki-Ho Kim is a professor of environmental science at American University, and he is the executive director at the Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning there as well. His research focuses on understanding how environmental drivers such as nutrient pollution and climate change affect the health of coral reefs. He has been a member of the Ocean Studies Board at the National Academies, and we are so looking forward to the discussion that's about to happen. Before we move on, a few logistics. The first part of today's program is pre-recorded, but while you're watching it, our guests are present in the virtual green room. You can be taking questions as they arise. So as questions come to you, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. We will all come on after the video to continue the discussion. We are also going to use the chat function in Zoom, which is also at the bottom of your screen, for what we call community share. When we host DASERs live, we would allow anyone in the audience to take the mic, introduce themselves, and to share cross-disciplinary projects. Today, we're going to use the chat function to do that. So please introduce yourself, where you're from, and use the Q&A button for questions. And again, the community share will be in the chat. So let's begin. Cultural Programs of the National Academy of Sciences, along with Issues in Science and Technology and American University, is pleased to present a conversation about climate change and the creation of empathy.
We're living in the midst of historic, monumental environmental change. Whether we come at it from an artistic standpoint or a scientific standpoint, we have a great chance to use our voices to reveal the truth and reality of what's going on in the world around us.
The times are calling us, all us creatives, to do what we can to call attention to this issue and this times we are living in.
science and art are just totally interwoven. I use documentary filmmaking and the power of storytelling to help preserve the beauties and wonders of our planet.
We need to more than simply address the curiosity of people. We need to share that empathy that we have.
I think that it's vital to use these wonderful artistic tools that we have to reveal the reality of what's around us and tell ourselves a clear-eyed story about what's happening on this planet.
There seems to be a common thread throughout all of your work of climate change, and all of you have passions about and ideals about how that fits into what you do. And I wonder if we could maybe start with you, James, and just kind of talk about the role of what you do as a photographer and as a filmmaker. You know, how do you see that fitting in and serving the communication of climate change? And what is the role of creating empathy towards these issues?
So many questions there, so many issues there, but I've been looking at this intersection of people and the rest of nature for 40 years, really, since I started photographing with any degree of seriousness. And I think that it's vital to use these wonderful artistic tools and communication tools that we have to, reveal the reality of what's around us and tell ourselves a clear-eyed story about what's happening on this planet. There's this tremendous historical change going on right now where humanity is affecting earth, air, fire, and water, and plants and animals. And in turn, we are affecting our terms of engagement with the rest of the natural world around us. So these are monumental changes, and people of the future, 50 or 100 or 200 years from now, will be looking back at our time, thinking about who were these people? What were they aware of or not aware of? What were they doing? And so we get a chance to tell that story. And I personally am very touched by how this process of systemic environmental change is affecting individuals around me. It affects me in my life in terms of the health of my lungs and pneumonia that I had as a consequence of breathing a lot of fire smoke a few years ago when I was working on a film. But I'm also acutely aware of how it affects many, many other people. There are social justice issues, and I'm quite sensitive to the human concerns around these physical and biological issues.
Diane, as an artist, you've been working in this process for a while, and I wonder if you could kind of give us an overview of how you came to be interested in climate change as an artist and as a painter.
I started a long time ago, like James. I have about 40 years under my belt. And I started off as a landscape painter. And what we did way back then, last century, is en plein air painting. I put myself in the landscape. I love the landscape. I love broad, huge geological phenomenon, basically because I came from New York City and lived in an apartment building. But we were in trouble as a planet. And I felt if I was going to be a responsible citizen artist, I had to pay attention more to those issues than just to the beauty of nature. Although I believe in beauty, I believe in aesthetics. And so I've taken my practice and kind of applied it to these issues that James just raised, but in a very visual way. Ironically, I never put people in my work. It's about people looking at the landscape and experiencing it. And in the last 15 years, my work is totally devoted to that. And yeah, it's been a journey, and it continues.
Maggie, tell us about your process and your work.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to serve on a panel with everybody today. I often think, how do we get started in what we do? And I was very fortunate. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and did a lot of backpacking and hiking from the time I was a little kid. Very fortunate to have parents that really engaged us in nature and the wilderness. And I remember a turning point where I took that for granted until there was an oil spill when I was about 9 or 10 years old that just decimated the wildlife, the bird life, the marine life in the San Francisco Bay. And my parents actually took us out of school for a week to go help with in a warehouse cleaning off oil gunk off of pelicans, which were very endangered at the time. And I was struck, even at that age, of how fragile our planet is, how much it needs our care. And I think that was just something that spurred me into wanting to tell stories and engage people through storytelling and through photography and primarily for me, documentary filmmaking, to really, help people connect with our planet and connect with the environmental issues. And more than ever today, we're facing really a crisis. And so I use that documentary filmmaking and that powerful, the power of storytelling to really try to what I call not just engaging and inspiring, but actually activating audiences to get more involved, to really help with conservation and help preserve the beauties and wonders of our planet.
Kehoe, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your work in this area.
Sure. So I come from a very different perspective. I'm a marine biologist, and the focus of my work has been on mainly the coral reefs, but more recently on seagrasses as well. And so my thinking about this has been really the animal-centric and not really thinking about broader impacts of climate change. But that has really evolved over the last decade or so. And so my research has really evolved from understanding the basic needs of these organisms and how they thrive in their environments to understanding how pollution and climate change is contributing to their decline. And so in terms of trying to engage people in the kind of work that I'm doing in coral reef conservation and get them interested in that effort has pushed me to think about how I might elicit empathy from those who may not have ever seen a coral reef or been out on a reef where those kinds of visceral reaction may have been created. And so through pictures and videos, they have been really the main mode of reaching out to people who may not have some very much familiarity with reefs and the kind of work that's going on in my lab and in labs around the world.
Thanks, Kehoe. James, I know that your work, especially your work with the ice, and your documentation of the ice over time, showing the melt, has been cited in scientific journals and papers. So it kind of brings up that question. I mean, we do talk about artwork in terms of communication and creating empathy, but also at what point, can this sort of contribute to research?
Well, I became interested in glaciers when I was 18 or 20 years old, and it took several decades before professional circumstance took me into looking seriously at the retreat of glaciers and ice sheets. And that turned into this project that began in 2007 called the Extreme Ice Survey. And that developed into a network of as many as 43 time-lapse cameras in various parts of the world, from Mount Everest to Antarctica to Alaska and Greenland and Iceland in between, looking at the way glaciers were reacting to the changing environmental conditions around them. And right now we've got an archive of well over 1 million frames of time-lapse images documenting what has happened right under our noses, right during our lifetimes right now. So I'm very excited that those pictures have had such a social impact. I mean, they've been scooped up on various social media feeds. They've been the subject of one Nova show, one major documentary film, Chasing Ice. They're also in my relatively new documentary film, The Human Element, which came out a few years ago. And there's two things that I think are the secret sauce in everything that I've managed to accomplish. One is I heard an anthropologist talking on the radio a few years ago about how what distinguishes human beings is that we seek patterns and we like to tell ourselves stories. And what we're all doing here is, with science, we're seeking the patterns of what goes on in the world. And with art, we're telling ourselves the stories of what those patterns mean. And through that narration of story to our fellow human beings, we can affect how we engage with the world, our own human world, and the world around us, and we can affect the future. So I get very, very excited about the things we've been able to do to tell a different story and to affect the political system, the social system, the governmental behaviors. And I have reason to believe that we've made a good impact there. And in addition to that, we've supported the scientific community with visualizations and knowledge that has proven to be useful in some of the publications.
Kehoe, I mean, as a scientist, I mean, a lot of what you do is observe. And I'm wondering if you could talk about, the tools you use. These tools are used differently for you in research, not just in communication to the public. Talk about how you go about doing your research in that context.
Yeah, a lot of the work that we do requires being present on the reefs. You can take photographs and keep them as records of how things have changed over time, but being out there to document and unfortunately, the declines in the coral reefs and the seagrass beds and other coastal ecosystems over the last several decades that I've been out there. And so it's sort of a very visceral, visual kind of work that I engage in. And in many cases, it's really difficult to convey that sort of visual record to the people that I engage with. And to that point, I think there are a couple of things. One is it's especially working on coral reefs, it's easy to engage people in the work that I do. Everybody's fascinated by coral reefs and what they represent. But I think it requires another step to engage them really deeply to elicit empathy. They're curious about what corals and coral reefs are, but they often don't take the next step of trying to figure out what their roles are in their decline. And to make those connections, you really have to talk about the people who are impacted by the loss of the coral reefs. Because empathy is really about how we feel about other people and how they might think. And so unless you make that connection to the people who are severely impacted by the reefs, the loss of livelihood because of decline of fisheries, or public health issues because the reefs are no longer preventing storm surges, and this is hitting home these days, even North America, unless you make those connections, it's really difficult to drive that engaged and informed action by the general public, who really don't have intimate interactions with many coastal environments.
Kehoe makes an excellent point. I mean, to build that empathy, you have to build connection. I think we know as storytellers that there are a wide range of ways to do that. And my most recent film, Unbreathable, The Fight for Healthy Air, which came out last year, made in partnership with the Center for Environmental Filmmaking, the Center for Environmental Policy at American University, and the American Lung Association was a primary partner. It celebrates and really highlights 50 years of the Clean Air Act. I mean, if you think about the smog in Los Angeles, I mean, I experienced that as a child. Your eyes are burning. You could actually taste it. It was so awful. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. And there are a lot of challenges ahead. So when I set out to make that film, I wanted to find that balance of being able to look at the historical policy and regulatory advancements, but also really engage audiences in the battle we have today, particularly in an environmental justice and equity. And so we told very personal stories as well, and interwove those to show how we really create a sense of connection and empathy with people in different parts of the country who are very much struggling to live in areas that have really unhealthy air.
Maggie, I'm delighted to hear that you were tackling air, because that's been a big pet interest of mine, and I tackled it as best I could in different ways over the last 5 or 6 years. It's a difficult subject, but so much of what we're grappling with the climate is fundamentally a problem of revealing air and seeing air and comprehending air, that this magical substance that surrounds us that happens to be invisible is at the center of everything. And we don't appreciate it because it's free and you don't see it, you don't feel it. And yet it's the entire climate story derives from the air story.
Yeah, I really struggled to figure out how to open the film in a way that everybody could connect. You know, and what do we all do? We breathe. We breathe 20,000 times a day. So that's a unifying concept. So I open it with just showing a number of people breathing. And because it's invisible unless you see really bad smog. So, you know, but it's something that we all share. It's part of our humanity. So again, you make a really great point.
We need to more than simply address the curiosity of people. We need to share that empathy that we have for the work that we're doing so that they're motivated into action to create the political will to pass acts like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. So we need not just sort of quelling of curiosity, but driving home that these things impact the livelihoods and the health of people around us, the people that we care for and the people that we should care for.
Asking us to talk about empathy is so great. And it's kind of a hard question for an artist. Maggie, I think you do a great job, and Jim does too. I still remember your keynote at the AGU way back in 2018. I try to do it in a much more abstract way, and I believe it can work because with any artwork, I think the audience can sense when the artist is really authentic and making work from the heart. And that's if it's music, film, however abstract it is, we have an emotional reaction as people to what we see. And I, as an artist, I use whatever visual magic I can find. And after 40 years of working, I got a lot that I know, and in many medias. So I'm basically a painter, but I'm a photographer, and I'm a videographer in a very different sense from James. I don't journal anything. I don't report. What I do is I try to admit my emotional reaction and get an emotional reaction from people. And that's part of empathy. I mean, my God, look at what we're looking at today in terms of all the climate crises in front of us, including Hurricane Ida, which I just experienced myself. People respond to other people. That's what empathy is all about. That's what love is about, and humanity. And I think we, in all our different disciplines and artists, we try to express and bring that expression to the viewer. And it's, been proven psychologically that people do respond sometimes better to visual, emotional images than they do to facts or data, even though we need people like Kehoe to keep turning out the data so that we can understand what we're doing. And that's what I do as a painter.
One of the ways that I've seen empathy and connection expressed in the visualizations is through portraits, especially portraits that zero in on the eyes of the subject, whether the subject is a human being or it's a chimpanzee or whatever. We mammals, with our two eyes here in the front of our heads, whether there's a term for what that sort of vision is called, bi something or another, biorbital or some such thing. But we like to understand, to engage with other creatures that have that same kind of vision. And I have found that in the course of chasing wildfires, that one of the best ways to put across the intensity and reality of that was looking into the eyes of the firefighters. Or if you want to talk about endangered wildlife, it's kind of hard to go look at all the slaughter and misery that goes on in the world and have a picture that somebody wants to see. But if you show a portrait of a chimp or an orangutan where you can really sense their individuality and their personality, and maybe even the fact that they're philosophizing about the world around them, that grabs people. And it's a very potent way to make a connection with these big issues that sometimes can seem abstract and distant.
I would argue, James, that it doesn't only have to be done through a narrative. I think of a painting that's in this exhibition called Summer Heat. And I brought together a lot of these issues, including that iconic image of the kangaroo and the fires that were in Australia. So I think there are many ways of coming to it. And I marvel at how people get it. and they can get it in a very poetic way that isn't a narrative. And that's what I keep trying to do.
I have a couple of clips from Unbreathable, the fight for healthy air. And one of them, I think it's about making the connection, but it's also about creating that intimacy. So whether it's going into an art exhibit and being right there, just really, we've been in this like such a weird virtual world for the last year and a half, and actually be able to connect in a way that you feel like there's a sense of intimacy with the person or an animal, the artwork. And one of the clips that I think just really represents that in Unbreathable is with Mary, who lives in a parish near Cancer Alley, which is an area in Louisiana that's had 40 years of really bad pollution. And she just takes us on a drive, and she's pointing out from house to house different people that she knows who have died because of the air pollution in that area. And it's so intimate in that car, it just draws you right in. One of the things we struggle with, I think, around climate issues and our climate crisis and environmental disasters is that sense of gloom and doom. And, when Al Gore came out in 2006 with Inconvenient Truth, all the way through to just recently, we're just like inundated with these gloom and doom stories, and it just leaves us feeling deflated, like, well, so okay, it's done, we're toast. What are we going to do? So how do you turn that around and really give people a pathway forward? Kehoe was mentioning this earlier. What do people do with that information? What can we do? Is there anything we can do? So the last story in Unbreathable is about a group of high school kids that come together to fight against the building of yet another incinerator in Baltimore, a mile away from their school. And it takes them 3 years. They get the entire community involved. These are 16-year-olds. And they finally do defeat the building of another incinerator in that area. And so there's a sense of, yes, we can come together. Yes, there is hope if we come together and we work together and we really think of it as just not just for ourselves, but for the community as a whole. So those two, I think, are super important when we talk about what art can do, any kind of art, and how art and science can come together with information and that sense of empathy and community and hope and humanity that we can build.
Many of the stories that we don't tell enough of are stories of success and stories of places where things like corals and other wildlife are doing well, to
Yes.
give us hope, to give us a baseline for where we should be shooting forward in terms of how we restore our environment. That all is not lost. And I think more stories like that are coming out, and they are providing hope and places to start looking to for inspiration.
We're stuck in a curious conundrum right now as creative people. On the one hand, we want to put out optimistic stories and give hope. But on the other hand, we're human beings living in a time when you feel like there's daggers going into your heart over all the malfunctions in the economic system, the political system, the social system, and you see what's happening, and we're not turning the wheel in a positive direction fast enough, it seems at times. So how do you, as an honest creator, express the truth that you're living in, as well as the fact that philosophically you want to put out an optimistic, what I often call a roses and moonbeam story. And I would love to do roses and moonbeam stories, and yet I feel like, man, the reality I'm living in is often pretty dark. We've been sucking down smoke here in the Front Range of the Rockies ever since early June. And last summer we had 5 months of it. So I don't know. It's a tough balancing act between hope and reality, it seems.
I think we're all aware of what James speaks about. There's a lot of doom and gloom, but I'm not a doom and gloom person. So what I try to do is bring hope through beauty. But I mix it up. It isn't all beautiful roses, believe me. So you might find a piece of dead coral embedded in one of my paintings. You might find charred wood, which was one of the answers to a recent piece I'm doing about the Amazon forest. There are ways of mixing it so that it really is about life. Life is good and bad. Life is crappy, but there's also hope because we're human and we have to, I think, as artists, bring out that connection between all of us. I have a whole series in this exhibition called the World Map Series. And I literally use world maps to speak about glacial melt, coral reef degradation. And in 2020, again, there are metaphoric ways to address the real issues that are upon us, but yet instill some kind of hope and beauty so that people can walk away aware because of the mix-up in the exhibition of fact and text, but also with some sense of hope to move forward and act, okay? That's another thing. Certainly your films do, Maggie. Act. We have to get people to realize that they do have agency.
I have found that this aesthetic issue of putting beauty into the midst of these subjects is the other really key thing for me to do. That really ever since about 1985 or so, all of my work has either explicitly or implicitly, when I'm out shooting, I'm trying to find something that's incredibly beautiful in terms of color, form, light, texture, action, whatever it is, as a way of seducing a viewer into thinking about a certain subject. And it can be tough sometimes to find an explicit documentary version of that. So a lot of times I have to revert to or go to symbolic treatments of these subjects in order to bring the beauty across. But it's the beauty that so often seems to be the key. So I hear what you're saying, Diane.
Yeah, it's primal. I really think so. I mean, James, your work is beautiful. And I think that's so important that we include that in our work. I mean, that is a way of making people care, because then we understand, I come back to, we understand how fragile that is and what a loss it would be. What a loss it is that we're losing so much of our amazing, gorgeous nature. And we're part of that nature. We're not separate. I mean, I sometimes get really perplexed by this idea that there's humans and then there's the rest of the planet. It doesn't work that way. We're very much just one more species on this planet. Unfortunately, right now, very destructive species. But we're all connected, and so those beautiful images, I think just remind us of that.
That connection, that fact that we are on the continuum with the rest of nature and are not separate from nature, is at the essence of this book that I've just done, that's about to be released next month. And it is called The Human Element, and the exhibition of the pictures that will be at the National Academy starting next month is around that same theme. It unpacks all of that about, who we are and where we are on the continuum with the rest of nature.
I think that also speaks to how we represent nature, at least in photographs, at least in terms of the work that I do, because I think it's often the case that people take pictures of nature in its sort of pristine state without people in it. But I think that takes away that connection between humanity and the rest of nature, that we are in it deeply and mucking things up. And that reminder, as well as getting people to understand the scale of nature through photographs and movies. I think that's also important too, not to separate nature as something that is different than what we do.
Yeah, and I think scale comes into play, Kehoe, with that. Certainly a huge movie screen has impact. And in this exhibition, I have paintings. There's one that's 8 foot by 15 feet. So you can't help but look into it, feel part of it, walk back and forth. And even though I don't put people in it, the people in my work are the people who look at the work, who encompass the work and interact with it. So I think scale is a very important dynamic tool for artists, for painters. Oh, and I should say, I have 2 videos in this exhibition. Actually, one's a quote from Chasing Ice. And most of it is my own footage from Antarctica and the Arctic. And again, it's a very metaphoric film, but it's 10 feet by 10 feet. You walk into the space and you're confronted with sound by Alana Rebick, who worked with me, and you're confronted by images that talk to you about glacial melt. And then you turn to another part of the space and you see paintings about glacial melt. And you actually see crackle that looks like ice, but it's a material. So materiality is very important to me. And that's also about scale, because from far away, you're looking at something you identify with. But as you get close, it's material, it's process. And it makes you think that someone had to do that. Some human being put that together. It's just not out there. And I think that's another way that people interact with their reality and with the sense of nature and the natural world.
One of the questions that's been that keeps coming back, not a question, but it's a comment. Everybody is using the word impact, and I'd like to unfold or unpack that a little bit more. There was all kinds of wonderful discussions about, did Ansel Adams's photographs influence some legislation on the Hill? And of course, we know that the photos and the books were passed around, but then that goes to what Kehoe was talking about, of this sort of ideal of the utopian landscape, of somehow or another the landscape is separate from us. But and Maggie, you kind of started down this way, but I'd like to also get Kehoe's as a scientist. How do we measure impact? And is it necessary to measure it when we're talking about this? But how do we know what we know that we're influencing? We also have, and I'll just throw this out there for James. We took some initial questions as people are registering, and one of the questions was asking about the impact of the movie Chasing Ice that you did. So within that context, I wonder if we could dig a little bit deeper into. And I'd love to hear, Kehoe's perspective as a scientist is, how do we know we're successful?
That's a really interesting question for a scientist to handle, because for a very long time, we've really focused on the work itself and the research products, like namely papers and things like that, not the impact of that work on society in general, although we are becoming more aware of that as an important aspect of the work that we do. And so I haven't deeply thought about it, but it certainly is about the awareness that people have about these environmental issues, what they've engaged in terms of civil discourse or political activism. And those things are pretty palpable on a campus like American University, where you know what percentage of your students are actively involved in politics. And I think we also get a sense from general public polls on how people are feeling about some of these environmental issues. And so, the connection is not direct in terms of what we do and how the public then takes that information and turns it into action. But I think a lot of scientists have the hope that by contributing facts to the discourse, that they are providing at least the basis for making decisions about what the best path forward is.
I'd like to pick up JD on that thread you mentioned about Ansel Adams. I had an experience that touched me quite a bit about 10 years or so ago. I had just given a multimedia presentation in a big auditorium in San Francisco, and this woman came up to me, wonderful, stately, distinguished woman with long gray hair, and she looked to be in her mid-70s or so. And she said, "I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing, and Ansel would be happy that you're doing that too." And I looked at her and I said, "How do you know that? How do you know that Ansel would be happy about that?" And she said, "Well, he was my father-in-law, and I knew him very, very, very well. And if he were alive today, he would be doing exactly what guys like you are doing. It wouldn't be about pristine pictures of Half Dome anymore. It would be about this reality that we're living in." So that stayed with me, and I like that. I hope she was right, but in any case, I'm doing what I have to do with my time in history, and it's different than what he did in his time.
I use that great photographer when I do my PowerPoints with students. And what I point out to them is that artists really throughout history have been involved with the environment. I mean, he was part of the conservation movement. We had Yosemite with the painters that went out west that started the national parks. You have Cole and Oxbow. Here's a guy in the 1800s doing a photograph and already talking about clear cutting. Okay, so every artist in their own time does find a way to acknowledge the world and the natural world they live in, because we all love what we see. That's why we're artists. So that was the point I was going to raise, JD. But yes, I'm always struggling with how to get both ideas across, how to be honest about being a painter where I love surfaces and I love beauty, but also acknowledging there's shit going on. We got to deal with it. And it's about putting it all together and using visual cues, using cues that Kehoe and his colleagues use when they have those NOAA maps. I use them all the time. In my paintings, you can find them. They're like glued in. Okay, so you got the heat showing, but then you might also have the beauty of the coral. And it's that balance that I struggle with, but I think people, they see it, they do sense it. Your point earlier about how to measure, that's something I've been asked a lot in my talks. And we need some more social scientists doing that. I only have anecdotal information about people responding or crying sometimes. I can't figure out a way to do that, but there are scientists out there that should. I mean, there is proven data that does say people respond emotionally, but it'd be cool to be able to measure which painting does more. Or
how do you get scientists to think more about impact, broader impact? Because right now the system isn't set up for promoting impact as a way we measure our scholarship. Is there a value to training scientists to be storytellers in a way that touches the public more?
I have like 3 different thoughts going in different directions right now. But one is that I love science. And I think there's so many amazing stories to tell about science. And science and art are just, they're totally interwoven. And and how do you inspire the next generation of scientists? Through amazing storytelling about the science. Science affects us just in the same way. It's part of our humanity. It's not separate. And so encouraging scientists to really share their stories of discovery, to share their stories of innovation, to share their stories of just the experience of working in marine biology or working with coral reefs. That kind of exploration, scientific exploration, I think is incredibly exciting. And so I would hope very much that it would be recognized as a very valuable part of research and scholarship, if for no other reason than to inspire the next generation.
Now, as we all know, a lot of the funding agencies at the end of the grant application, there's that little bit about tell us what the broader impacts are going to be, and so often that's tacked on as a not very thoughtful or creative addendum to the proposals, but it can be a major part of what the projects are all about. And to the extent that can be fostered in these grant applications and by the grantors, I think it's all to the good. The thing I'm constantly struck by from, I read a number of the scientific journals on a regular basis, is that science knows so much more than what's getting out in the world. I think the general public, even the well-educated general public, might have been touched by maybe 5% or 10% of what cutting-edge science knows. There is so much out there, and it's just not getting communicated. So there's a wide field of opportunity here for storytelling, both starting from the science side and going outward, and from the art side, working with science going inward. For me, the essential part of this is that we're living in the midst of historic, monumental environmental change. And whether we come at it from an artistic standpoint or a scientific standpoint, we have a great chance to use our voices to reveal the truth and reality of what's going on in the world around us. And I think it's an amazing time to be living, and it's an amazing opportunity for us as creative people.
Well, I certainly didn't begin my journey as an artist thinking that I would be someone who would be an activist, but the times are calling us, all us creatives, to do what we can. And I'm doing my part, and we all are. There are artists all over the world who are working to call attention to this issue and this times we are living in, which is a pivotal time for all of us. And I think we're aware of that.
I think every single person has a story to tell. Sometimes they don't have the tools, other people do. So that's why we need to come together so that everybody can really make their story heard. You know, that's the way that we get connected, whether it's through citizen science or citizen storytelling, if you want to call it that. I just think that everybody has a voice and a story, and that's what connects us through our humanity. And if we come together, I think we really can address some of these really critical issues we're facing today. Climate, social, it's not separated out. It's all together.
Wonderful discussion. I'm going to invite all the panelists to turn on their videos and their audio. And while they're doing that, I just want to thank, first of all, everyone for their contributions to this, but I also want to thank all of you for being here. Everybody, both on our panel and in our audience, just an incredible turnout, almost 400 people joining from all over the world. The chat is just very active, and just love the fact that everyone's engaged. So many questions are already coming in, and I want to just kind of jump into it. There's several people that were just sort of wanting to ask each of you your stories that you have of your favorite reactions to your work, and that also includes, you know, to your scientific work, Kehoe. But you know, to the movies, to the paintings, to the photography, what have been some of your favorite responses? I mean, in a way, that's what we're talking about, is not just your intent behind the work, but how people engage it. Diane, I know you said that you've seen people emotional in front of your paintings and starting to cry.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. It happened for me in a show in Houston. I don't know if it was 2016 or 2019. Yeah, I guess it's 16. Now, Houston, think about it. Houston is the capital of the fossil fuel industry. And there I am in an art gallery having a show on climate change. But there were people there that reacted. And one woman was very moved because the work was about comparing the before and the after, what geologists do all the time. And this woman was moved to tears. And I said, anything wrong? And I walked up to her and she said, well, I've been to that glacier and I know what it used to look like. So she was responding to both my paintings, which, you know, one was maybe from a source material from the Ice Institute or USGS that came from maybe, I don't know, 1950, and the other was this century. She was that moved. So that was an impactful thing. But as we said in the earlier discussion, it would help, and people have been asking this question throughout the chat, it would help if we had a way of measuring. But I do think we make a difference. I do.
Certainly these anecdotes are powerful. Anyone else on our panel want to share stories?
Well, I'll tell a story about the aftermath of a screening in Los Angeles. a screening of the film Chasing Ice. And in there's the climactic scene is this big glacier in Greenland collapsing into the ocean. And we got two contradictory responses from people walking out onto the sidewalk afterwards, and the interns recorded these. One reaction was some guy said, "How did you guys do the special effects where you made that glacier collapse?" It was like, are you kidding? Are you out of your freaking mind? That was real, dude. That's the whole point. And then another woman came up who quickly acquired the name LA Woman after the Doors song, and she was in tears. And she said, I understand climate change now, and I just didn't understand it before because I got everything I knew from Fox News and Bill O'Reilly, and I just didn't understand what was going on. And now I have to go and apologize to all the people I threw out of my house during arguments over climate change, and now I get it. And that was very touching, and as you can tell, it's still touching for me.
Yeah, sometimes we don't, and Diane actually mentioned this earlier about, we don't always respond to data, but sometimes we are touched in other ways that make sense. And that sounds like, James, that's what happened for this person, is that it clicked. It helped him click. Kehoe, when you're on the field, you do a lot of interaction and training with people and talking. I was just kind of wondering if you don't have the same response of people looking at your artwork like Maggie and Jim and Diane, but you have to have some sort of a feeling of reward when you see somebody out in the field with you who just has that sort of eureka moment.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's one of the sort of the small pleasures that I get as being a faculty member, being able to expose my students to the work that really drives my passion for coral reef conservation. And so many of them have never set out, and half the students I take out to places like Guam or Saipan or the Bahamas, this is their first time traveling outside of the country, and to be literally thrown into this blue waters of the tropics, being up so close to the creatures and seagrasses, it is a real sort of a moment of awakening for their curiosity and their interest in pursuing maybe this as part of their career. But there are other moments where I sometimes run into those living on those coasts who are residents of those places that I visit, who sometimes come and ask me, "What are you doing? Why are you collecting pieces of coral or even seagrasses?" And I explain to them this is part of an effort to see how these organisms are doing and what could be done to improve their environment. And they're pleasantly surprised that people are interested in the environment and the things that are happening around them. And so those kinds of moments, I think, are really times when I feel really encouraged about the work that I'm doing, in spite of the fact that globally coral reefs and other coastal ecosystems are on decline. So it's a sort of a dual sort of contrasting moment.
I would say, Kehoe, there's another way I think you get gratified, and that's when artists like me thank you and labs and learn from you and take that information and somehow process it in a visual way.
Absolutely.
I really think we have a symbiotic relationship. We're all in this together. We care, every one of us here care about our planet, and we work together in mysterious ways to get the message out.
I was recorded for a panel earlier this week that will be at Jackson Wild Summit next week, called The Science of Storytelling. And I think, as filmmakers or artists or any kind of storyteller, we intuitively know a lot of things, but it's really interesting to actually start to put that research into it. I saw a lot of questions about how do you measure it? How do you evaluate impact? And the impact media research that we're doing, thanks to HHMI, is really looking at how do different emotions connect with different kinds of audiences? How do different kinds of partnerships come together in a way that makes the process more participatory, with a greater kind of storytelling equity? How do you, reach out through all sorts of different platforms today to really try to engage different audiences and be a catalyst for change. And I think, you know, we're in a very messy, very fragmented media landscape today. So understanding more about how to do that and understanding how to really measure that impact. I mean, we also have this glut of content out there. So being more strategic about it, I don't think that undermines the creativity at all. I just think it enhances it and helps us understand how to have more impact in a meaningful way.
Yeah, Maggie, you're absolutely right. There were a lot of questions in the chat and the Q&A about impact. And I wondered, could you give us that website one more time, where that source?
Yeah,
or maybe even post it in the chat for us.
I will do that. It's www.cefimpactmedia.org.
Fantastic. And Alana will be sending out a transcript of the chat. So
Great.
Everyone who's shared all of these websites and contact information is really quite wonderful.
I'd like to share just another quick story if there's time,
Sure.
because this was something that struck me so much. I've done a lot of kind of large screen and immersive media for large traveling exhibitions, and one of them was the Roads of Arabia, looking at ancient history on the Arabian Peninsula. And the exhibit of artifacts came, and the movies were kind of interwoven through the artifacts. But the opening of that exhibit were just these 3 ancient tombstones, thousands of years old, with just expressions on their faces. And as James had mentioned earlier, you know, the eyes, I mean, it's so much about the eyes, right? And kids, groups of school kids would come in and sit down and just start talking to the faces on these ancient tombstones. And I'd be sitting there in the corner just watching this. And I thought, if there was ever evidence of how much our humanity is connected, it was right there in the room at that moment. It was just amazing.
That's a great story.
There are several questions. I mean, to build on that point, Maggie, there were several questions about empathy as being sort of human-centric, but it's also, there's a number of questions asking about how we create empathy towards and with non-human, either animals, plant lives, and things like that. And to what extent does that relationship play in to your work? I'd throw that open to anyone, but is being more than just a sort of human interaction? James, I'm reminded of, especially since we just hung your exhibit past couple of days, all those wonderful animal photos that you've taken in your survivors book from many years ago, and just thinking about the relationship to every living entity on the earth, and not just between humans.
Yeah, these other characters are a remarkable emotional doorway for us. Sometimes emotional, sometimes physical and aesthetic. And that Survivor series really taught me that fact. And I learned so much about myself from being around all those animals, especially the primates. And I learned so much about what the real shape of nature is from being around those characters. And I hope that some little fraction of that comes back out to the viewers through those pictures. You know, one never knows. And a lot of times we all feel like, or I feel like I'm talking into the bottom of a well, or I'm talking to myself about something. And it's always nice when the projects get done and you get the audience reaction. But nevertheless, it's great to know that these pictures do touch people, and the animals especially can be an interesting conduit for people of a certain sensibility.
Well, I think the more knowledge there is, or the more information, people get it. There was a wonderful exhibition about Alexander Humboldt, who was in 1800s. You know, there he was speaking about the connectedness of the whole world and of nature. And it comes to mind, maybe some of you have read that book, Overstory by Powell. Well, that was a story a lot based on a scientist, a woman from Canada named Susan Simard. And she just came out with her own book, Finding the Mother Tree. And she's a scientist that's talking about how everything in the earth is connected through trees talk to each other. They have a community of protecting each other. There's a language that's, not just the human language that we're speaking now. It's the language of the universe and of nature. And these stories come out, environment. Someone asked about, poetry and writing earlier in one of the chats. And I said there's a whole study, a discipline now called environmental humanism. So it's out there and it's more accessible to the general public, but it has to be an educated public. You're not going to hear about it on Fox News for sure. But I think there is empathy that grows beyond animals and each other, even to the whole world of nature,
I think that's really a wonderful observation and comment, is that, like the trees communicating, and not everything communicates with words, not everything communicates on the same time scale that we do. The communication between the trees, like you were saying, happens on a much slower passage of time. Maggie and Kehoe, I'm going to go on to another question because.
Well, I would just chime in
Okay.
a couple of things. I mean, I think,
Okay.
you see the giant sequoia tree right now that's being wrapped for protection from wildfires. I mean, it's our fabric, right? It's our fabric of our planet. And when we see certain species declining for man-made reasons, or we see, climate crisis ramping up these extreme weather events that are endangering things that have been around so much longer than we have, and I just think there's perspective there. So it's I think all species are interconnected, but there's also, I think, to your point, JD, the time factor that we're just little blips on this earth, and there's many, many, many organisms that have been around a lot longer than us. Just on a side note, I sure wish we could create smell in our films, because who hasn't smelled that deep earth of, being deep in a forest, or the beautiful smell of the seashore when the waves are crashing. I mean, that's, those make us very aware of our environment. And I'm sure Diane's got some little aroma therapy happening in the art exhibit.
From painting, yeah.
I mean, I joke, but it is just yet another reminder that our senses and the organisms around us are all interconnected. I'd love to hear about from Kehoe about his relationship with the coral reefs.
Yeah, I mean, not only that, but I think there's growing evidence that simply the size, the scale, the shapes, the smell are part of our evolutionary history, and we're less stressed out when we are in those environments, as opposed to the more geometric and regular sizes and shapes that we are built around us. And so, the idea of empathy may have different sort of routes in terms of how they affect us. It's sort of that basic comfort and feeling of calmness that surrounds you when you're snorkeling or scuba diving or walking through a forest. I think those really speak to how we are indeed connected to the world around us.
I just wanted to add, guess what? There are artists that are now involved with the sense of smell. I mean, that had to do with the major Rembrandt painting that opened up in Amsterdam. It's a whole new field. So, yeah.
One of the questions is ask the presenters about ways in which changes are being made, and are they positive? And specifically, I think they're asking Kehoe if you would talk about such things, for example, as the artificial reefs that are being created now in order to replace the natural reefs that no longer exist. And I mean, it may not be the right panel for this discussion, but as you're in these conversations, what are the stories that are coming back that are inspiring of the way that people are reacting to this need that are making positive changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of artificial reefs is a great one, but I think people are also seeing them as useful in very specific cases. And I did respond to that question on the chat. It works if the environment in which you transplant them back into is sustainable, right? You can't expect an artificial reef to sustain increasing water temperature and pollution that is affecting a coast. And so where we know that the environment can sustain corals for a longer time, then artificial reefs really make sense. And people are doing that around the world. The places that I visit, in places like Guam and Saipan, there's some very active artificial reef and coral plantation work going on. Similar for the east coast of the US, where lots of seagrasses are being replanted. And I suspect that there's some work gonna happen on replanting algae like kelp, which are also disappearing. And so I think in places where they can be sustained, these are really wonderful and great ideas. But they have to be taken within the context of what the environment affords in terms of their sustainability and long-term existence. That was a very scientific answer.
I think that's one of the things that they were looking for. So thank you, Iho. Another question that I'm looking at here, and I'm just sort of thinking about it, is we think about empathy, and I think for the most part we've talked about it in an individual basis. But what is the difference between an individual empathy in an individual versus building empathy within a community? And I realize we probably need a social scientist to tell us really that, but it might be worth just sort of thinking about for a moment. What is the difference when we're trying to either communicate or engage with an individual as opposed to a broader community?
Well, I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Maggie.
Oh, well, I was just going to point again to that last scene in Unbreathable. And I think, one of the things films can do is move things from the individual empathy level to a much broader community level. And then that network works out and that network works out. I mean, one of the things we've seen with Unbreathable is that every time it's screened, there are more screenings. And it builds this community that's coming together, not just for clean air in their area, but for clean air for everybody. And it becomes this vast community effort to try to make sure that there's equity in healthy air across our country and our planet. I think we're seeing this in filmmaking techniques as well. There's much more of a participatory, collaborative approach that's starting to happen, so that it's not just one group going over and saying, oh, okay, we're going to do a beautiful film about elephants and then take it back and show it in our Western developed country. Now there's much more of a collaborative approach happening, and so I think we see the community empathy growing in really interesting ways. It's that intersectionality, it's that idea that people on the front line, can have voices and participate in building the empathy, not just this inequity approach that's been kind of driving filmmaking in the past.
Yeah, I think the way I try to do it in my practice is, through symbols and key sort of like data, visual data. And as I said in the earlier presentation, I have this 56-foot long series of paintings based on the world maps. I mean, you can't not know what the whole world map looks like lately, because it's been spread all over any newsreel, any social media because of the pandemic. So I think people get it. I mean, what happens in Siberia is happening in Littleton or all the way to the California coast. And we all live in these places. So I think it's an implied group community. It's not one person that's being affected by the storms and by the fires and by the droughts. It's communities who are being affected. So I think maps is a way that people might relate to that, again, on an unconscious kind of level of imagery.
We've had quite a few. I'm trying to condense this because we're getting so many wonderful questions. I'm trying to consolidate some of them into certain more general questions. But there's a lot of sort of interest in the discussion about sort of our silos and how we're sort of interacting. And so I'm going to read this one. Would be interested in hearing from Kehoe about how the structures that reward scientists in terms of grants and in academia discourage them from putting time and effort into connecting with the public. I would also say also from connecting with maybe people in other disciplines as well, such as if you were to write a grant where you were going to work with artists, would that be frowned upon and encouraged? Yeah, so let me just throw that out there. I mean, I think that all of us have who have sort of skirted into academia or brushed up against it or are in it, that there's been these sort of barriers. So I guess in general, what are the barriers and what are the solutions, and what do you see as the outcome?
So I think the barriers have been eroding over time actively by academics. I remember when I was a graduate student, the idea of talking to the general public was good, but not really something that was really germane to the work that you did as a scholar. Your job was to publish papers, and if the general public made use of it, great, but that was really beyond what you needed to think about. What's been happening over the last, I think, 15 years has been very promising. The National Science Foundation, which is one of the main agencies for funding scientific research like mine, have been emphasizing the broader impacts portion. That is, what is the value of the science to the broader community beyond the scientific community? And I remember in the olden days, you would put, I'm going to publish my results on the web, and that was mostly sufficient. I think that has changed dramatically. I think if you looked at these proposals, the broader impact sections are getting much more substantive, much more innovative. And I think if I post something like working with Diane to get out the results of my work, I think they would love it and would want to make sure that was funded and came to fruition. So that's one part of the thing that's happening to make broader impacts more prominent and germane to the work that I do. At the institution level, tenure and promotion was really about scholarship, and this was the original thinking that I was talking about, that is publish papers, get grants, and that's it. I know that at least at my institution, American University, we are going through a process of rethinking what impact of our work means. And I think there are opportunities for other institutions to engage in that work, because the broader impacts that we are talking about, affecting changes in behavior, how people think about these issues, I think that's important too. And so American University, we're in the process of thinking about what each of the fields and the broader impacts might look like, and codifying them into the tenure and review process. And I think that's a great sort of outcome, and something that I hope other institutions model.
So here's a question that we had a little while back earlier in the conversation, but I think it's in response to something that James might have brought up. I would like to hear the panelists speak more about climate and environmental justice and the indigenous communities and other frontline communities' responses to the climate emergency that influenced them. I'm not sure that this is the panel of experts to kind of really talk about indigenous knowledge and that sort of thing, but you all have this in mind and you've had some experiences. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about environmental justice and your take on it and your experience with it.
Well, I think it's safe to say that there's profound issues of environmental justice in the United States, on a regional basis, on a city-by-city basis, but also all around the world. That we all know that a lot of the impacts in the climate are coming from prosperous areas, and people in less prosperous areas are bearing the burden of those impacts, and it's profoundly unfair. Some of this has been touched on in various television documentaries to some very limited symbolic degree. We did that in The Human Element, but that wasn't ours to do in that particular narrative. But it definitely has to be addressed. We're all very sensitive from watching the news the past days about the injustice in how the disappearance of people is covered in the media. Right now, all eyes are on this story of one species of person, one race of person, and ignoring what happens to other ones. I just read this morning that in Wyoming, 710 indigenous people, or maybe it was 710 indigenous women, have disappeared in the relatively recent past, and virtually none of them got any coverage. So we have these profound blank spots in the way we think about things and talk about things.
Yeah, and how can we be more inclusive in our conversations and our communications? Anyone else want to comment on that, Kehoe?
Yeah, I think we have to be much more intentional about thinking about the audiences that we want to address. And I think that the incorporation, or very formal and intentional incorporation of social justice into environmental issues is one of the sort of the promising outcomes of the last decade or so. And at American University, I'm sorry to toot the horns of AU, but we just started a Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, because we do see that the impacts are disproportionately upon the poor, Blacks and Hispanics, the people of color. And so we want to be thoughtful about how we think about both the sources of the impact and the resources that are needed for those impacts to be reduced or mitigated, or for those communities to be able to thrive in spite of what's happening around them. And so I think both academically, socially, the awareness and the attention on equity, I think is a really important outcome of the last few years.
Well, I also want to chime in about American University, being I'm having the exhibition at your museum. You guys and I and many other faculty members have come together to create a symposium, which will happen on November 5th to 7th. And many of the topics that we're now discussing will be covered. It's not just about art and science. Actually, it's mostly not about that. It's about social justice. It's about youth movements. It's about activism through Maggie's films that she's going to be presenting, but a broad array of how climate change is affecting our whole society and many, many segments of that society. So I encourage people out there to keep posted on what American University's Seeing Climate Change symposium will be. It might be just virtual, it might be both, that remains to be seen. It's November, so who knows? Who knows what our community will be about by then.
Diane, thank you for putting that plug out there for the symposium. Yes, it's a big portion of it is focused on environmental injustice. And, one of the things from the storytelling filmmaking perspective is really making sure that we have diversity in front of the camera and behind the camera. And that's a big effort right now through the Center for Environmental Filmmaking and many other groups around the world looking at ways to build capacity. We have a former student, Emiliano Rupra, who did a beautiful high-end natural history blue chip film, Nomadus, about species that are migrating both endemic and outside of the country, migrating across Mexico. Gorgeous film. First time a blue chip natural history film has been made by an all Mexican team. And he pushed hard to get the additional funding so that training could be done with scientists and with the specialty equipment, and now has built capacity in that country in a way that hadn't been done before. And those are the kinds of changes we need to make so that everybody can share their perspective. I'm starting on a new film, Upstream Downriver, about the Clean Water Act, and we're doing a model where we will have numerous content producers, indigenous, people of color, all across the United States, being able to tell their stories in their storytelling fashion, not just in a box, to share together and come together around issues around water. And I think we just need to look at new models and new ways of doing things, and make sure that it's as inclusive as can be to really make change happen on this planet.
There's a subtext here underneath all this discussion, underneath all our work, within the chat stream, which is amazing. I'm just astounded at what I'm seeing off to the side of the screen here. My brain is zigzagging back and forth between watching Maggie and watching JD and watching the chat. But anyway, the subtext is about the emotional ecology of all of this. Through the knowledge, through the experience, through the world that we're living in, our hearts and souls are flayed open a lot of times by the intensity and sometimes the sadness and sometimes the frustration of what we're seeing and experiencing. There's so much knowledge. We know which way the world is going, and we want so much for things to go right. And it can be so god-awful frustrating to see how badly things so often seem to be going, in spite of all of our efforts to put out good messages and be hopeful and all of that. We have a feeling in our hearts too much of the time that this is a difficult, painful situation. And I've been reading things for the past several years about burnout among climate activists. Understandably, you just get tired of smashing your head against the wall and watching the bruises get bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. So I think we need to also be cautious in our hearts, in our souls, in our minds about preserving energy. You put everything on the line, and then you have to pull back a little bit and save something for yourself so you don't go insane and you have some energy left to keep on going.
That was so beautifully said. Thank you. I mean, I know just what you mean, but going back to community, we're all here together, and we all are in community with what we believe and love and are empathetic about, and I think that's so important. Not everything is bleak. I'm always trying to see the bright spot. I want to recommend another book. Probably all of you have read it already. Ministry of the Future. It has hope in it. Okay. And we have to believe in the future, and that gives us respite as well, Jim. But thank you. Those words were beautifully spoken.
Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce probably the last question, because I think it kind of builds on that question of hope. Is a couple of the questions we're talking about. What are the tools that you would recommend for kids or for teaching kids to think about environmental issues, to educate them? Because I mean, that is certainly that area where, it needs to be digestible for kids. How do we help our children deal with those same sort of emotional factors that Jim and Diane were just talking about? So that could be a nice way for us to end, is thinking about the future. How do we prepare the next generation?
Put them out in nature. That's the first thing.
I was going to say the very first thing, make sure they have those experiences. I mean, I come full circle, it's just getting out and playing in streams,
Yep.
being able to smell it, being able to feel it. The tactile is so important. You can't just watch it on a screen. I mean, I know I'm a filmmaker, but I'm saying that you can't just watch it on a screen. You can't just read it in a book. You have to go experience it. Go snorkel with the coral reefs. Get wherever you are. Find the little park, that's down the street or a bus ride away, and just go through and listen for the birds and feel the bark and hug those trees. I mean, it sounds kind of, but it's so important to connect with nature on that visceral level, because from that point forward, you get curious. And when you spark your curiosity, you want to know more and you want to know more. And kids are naturally curious. I think we have to start there.
I agree. That's the key. It could be a bug, it could be a mushroom in the grass, it could be anything, but it's a vehicle to connect on a very visceral level. And if you can get a kid to connect, the curiosity, as Maggie said, is there. Listen, we're all curious. That's what artists, filmmakers, scientists, this is what we all do. We're still kids. We still have that sense of curiosity, but we have to instill it and encourage it in a community now where screen is a major part of their lives. Get outside. It's crucial.
Yeah.
Safety outside.
Well, especially in this context, we talk about art and science, we talk about the silos, we talk about disciplines, but kids are not siloed. They experience things, and I just am thinking about, as you're talking about going out into nature, going out to dance, going out to move, going out to exercise, making things out of things that are found in nature. I'm trying to think of other ways of encouraging their natural curiosity to build.
Here's a simple one. My father was a mathematician, applied mathematician. And from a very early age, he'd take us and he'd show us the patterns in leaves, patterns in butterfly wings. Just look for patterns. I mean, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier about patterns. It's just like this adventure of discovery to find patterns all around us. It's, that's a great starting point.
Yeah, there's a wonderful side conversation going on in the chat about patterns and origins. So I encourage everybody to read that when we send it out. I just wanted to say thank you one more time to all of our panelists. Thank you for being here. Thank you for this wonderfully diverse conversation. We went into many different directions. Look forward to posting this video on our YouTube CPNAS channel shortly. We'll send out the transcripts. But if we could give you all a round of applause, I'm sure we would. And thank you to everyone who attended. We appreciate it, and we will see you again shortly. And be sure to follow up with Diane. You're actually going to be in the city in DC this weekend.
Yeah, starting. Actually, I'm meeting a group that Maggie's bringing over from the university.
Okay.
Let me think. Saturday, I'll be there from 11 until 3. And Sunday, I'll be at the museum from noon until 4.
Right.
I think the weekend of October 9th and 10th.
Right. And for James's exhibit, Alana and I will be giving public tours every Wednesday at 11. If that doesn't work, just give me an email and we'll try to get you in to see this beautiful exhibit by James Balog. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.